Okay, China. Anybody need to stretch? Anybody need a cocktail? Another piece of filet? Okay. So I'll move through this more quickly than you expect. The Chinese growth cannot be denied, right? But here's the thing. We've seen a lot of economic miracles in the past, a lot of quickly rising economic stars. More of them have crashed than have actually left the atmosphere. Think about Weimar Germany, think about the Soviet Union, think about the rising sun of Japan, think about the peripheral Eurozone. I mean, numerous countries in Latin America have attracted a lot of investor attention and yet disappointed economically, mismanaged their economy, and disappointed investors. So it's important, if you think about China, to note that over the last 35 years, 500 million people out of the 1.4 billion they have in their population have come out of poverty as China's come back onto the world stage. And that growth is terrific, but it also sows the seeds of its own destruction. So at this point, China's really got a dream, a new dream for national prosperity. And if they can do that, it's good for all of us. If they can realize that dream, it's good for all of us. If they cannot, and that dream remains a fantasy, it'll make the world more crisis-prone, it'll likely make the growth rate slower, and it'll make all of our investment returns less. So for us, the important question is, do you believe in the Chinese dream? Well, that's why I went to China. So here's the funny thing about the Chinese dream. It's kind of like Chinese deja vu, okay? So if you go back to Imperial China, it's 5,000 years old, as you all know. But Imperial China was a couple thousand years. And during that time, China was pretty big. Geographically, it's about the size of the United States. At this time, it was a little bit bigger. And basically, they had a saying in China that the mountains are far and or high and the emperor is far away. And what that basically meant was as long as you didn't cause too much trouble, you were kind of left alone. So there was a lot of relative freedom back during Imperial China. And that led to a civilization that was really very sophisticated, very cultured, very creative, very innovative. For instance, they came up with the first paper money. Now, here's a fact I didn't know. Obviously the U.S. government has the full faith and credit that backs U.S. paper money. In China, if you received money from somebody and you said you wouldn't accept it, the way that they guaranteed it was Kublai Khan would have you killed. So that's the way they backed their paper money. Everybody accepted it, and that was fine. So they had the first paper money, they had the first mechanized clock, they had the first compass. So to me, as I was sort of thinking about it, they had money, they knew what time it was, and they knew where they were going. And so they created the Silk Road, which you're hearing about being reconstructed now to a large extent. The Silk Road was 4,000 miles long. And it extended from Xi'an, which at the time was actually the most sophisticated and largest city on the planet, right? We read about Rome, etc. Xi'an was actually further ahead. And this long highway of trade, it enabled them to trade jade and silk and porcelain. In return, they received horses, they received grapes, so they could make grape wine, no more rice wine. They liked that. And also they received a lot of gold. So they became very, 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 very rich thanks to this artery that they created all the way to Rome. In fact, so much so that in 1820, China dominated the world economy. In fact, they were 33% of the entire world economy, much more than Western Europe and much more than the nascent United States of America. And remember, Columbus set out to find China. But things change, right? The British got mad at them because they weren't buying British goods, so they sold them some opium, which they didn't really want. Next thing you know, you have a war. The British Navy was far advanced. And so the Brits basically took their seaports, they took Hong Kong, after which politically the nation fractured into a bunch of zones controlled by warlords, and it spun the civilization into a long period of civil war and territorial dispute. And then finally, Chairman Mao came to the rescue. And yes, Mao did reunify China, which is why his picture's on the Imperial Palace. But at the same time, he eliminated things like freedom and commerce and individualism, which was not very good for the Chinese economy. So going back to 1820, extending to 1978, China went from being number one on the planet to being 5% of global GDP 150 years later. So clearly, Mao's dream for China actually turned out to be a nightmare. But where there's crisis, it creates opportunity. And so Mao died, right, which enabled a lot of things to happen, one of which was the rise of Deng Xiaoping. And he had a new vision for China. And this is a cover from 1978, which is kind of interesting. They spelled his name incorrectly on Time magazine. So his vision was, we're going to make China a modern, powerful socialist state before the end of the century. Well, how are we going to do that? To get rich is glorious, right? That was new. There was no concept of personal wealth. He completely turned the apple cart upside down. Like he said, it doesn't matter if the cat's white or black as long as it catches mice.